The first snow of November came 3 days early that year, and Sergeant Tova Rennick decided that was fine by her. She had chosen the property in the Laurentians precisely because the road to it washed out in spring and drifted shut in winter. The nearest town, a place called St. Donat, was 40 minutes south on a good day, an hour and a half on a bad one. She had not been to St. Donat in 6 weeks. She had not spoken to another human being in 11 days, and she was beginning to think 11 days was not nearly long enough. The cabin was small and deliberately so. One main room, a wood stove she'd installed herself, a cot she'd bought second-hand from a woman in St. Agatha who hadn't asked questions, shelves she'd built from spruce planks, still rough enough to catch on a sleeve. No internet, a satellite phone she kept charged, but faced away from herself on the windowsill, like a thing she was trying not to look at directly. The only living thing she allowed close to her was Koda. He was not technically hers. That was the part she turned over sometimes in the small hours, like a stone she kept finding in her boot. Koda was a Belgian Malinois, 6 years old, black-masked and amber-eyed, with the particular kind of stillness that only came from training so deep it had become reflex. He had been partnered with Master Corporal Jamie Flett for 4 years. He had been with the unit when the convoy hit the IED outside Kandahar. He had stayed beside Jamie through the night, through the extraction, through the first hospital, the second hospital. He had been transferred into her care 11 months ago by a handler liaison officer who had explained, in the gentle and clinical way of bureaucracy managing difficult things, that Koda required a familiar handler environment during his retirement transition period. What the officer had not said, and what Tova had understood perfectly, was that Koda would not eat for anyone else. He would not sleep. He paced. He sat at doorways and watched them with those amber eyes and waited for a footstep that was never going to come. She had not wanted him. She had told the liaison officer that clearly, calmly, and twice. She had a hard enough time managing the geometry of her own grief without taking on an animal's, but the liaison officer had a folder. In the folder was a photograph of Jamie, laughing at something off-camera, his hand on Koda's back. Tova had looked at that photograph for a long moment, and then she had said, "Fine, load him in the truck." She had driven north the next morning, and she had not stopped driving until she ran out of road. That was 8 months ago. Now Koda followed her from woodstove to window, to cot with the focused, unhurried attention of a dog who understood that his job at present was simply to not let her disappear. She resented it sometimes. She was grateful for it always. She had stopped trying to untangle those two things. The morning the fever started, she thought it was the cold. She'd been outside since before light, splitting the last of the birch rounds she'd hauled up from the tree line, and the exertion had made her feel strange in a way she couldn't quite locate. Not in her muscles, which ached cleanly and correctly, but somewhere underneath, in the core of her. She came inside and drank 2 cups of tea standing at the stove, and told herself it was the cold, it was the early morning, it was nothing. By noon she was on the cot, and she knew it was not nothing. She had a thermometer somewhere in the medkit. She found it eventually, fumbling through the canvas pouch she kept on the bottom shelf, and she held it under her tongue and waited and looked at the ceiling and listened to Koda's breathing from the floor beside her. 39.4. High but manageable. She'd had worse. She'd functioned at worse than this. She drank water. She slept. She woke in the dark with the stove cold and her teeth chattering so hard she bit the inside of her cheek. And when she pressed her fingers against her abdomen on the right side, she flinched so badly she knocked the thermometer off the edge of the cot. 40.1. Koda was on his feet before she was. He stood at the end of the cot and watched her with those amber eyes, and something in his posture had changed. Not the alert readiness of a working dog, but something quieter and more urgent, the way a dog looks when it is waiting for you to make a decision it cannot make for you. She lay still for a long time. The wind moved against the roof. Through the small high window she could see a wedge of sky going grey, which meant morning, which meant she had been lying there for at least 6 hours, and things had not gotten better. The satellite phone was on the windowsill. She looked at it. She looked at the ceiling. She thought about Jamie, which she tried not to do, and she thought about the last time she had let herself need something from another person, and how that had gone, and she pulled herself to a sitting position with both arms and sat there breathing through her nose until the nausea passed. Koda pressed his forehead against her knee. She put her hand on his head without thinking about it. "Okay," she said to no one in particular. The drive down the mountain was the worst 40 minutes of her adult life, and she had served 2 tours in a combat zone. She had to stop twice, once to be sick on the roadside in the dark, Koda pressing against her thigh, once because she could not for a moment remember which direction the road bent, and she needed to sit still and let her vision stop doubling before she killed them both in the ditch. The truck had winter tires, and she was grateful for that in a distant, removed way, the gratitude of a person whose mind had simplified itself down to the single project of surviving the next 10 minutes. She made it to the emergency entrance at Centre Hospitalier Laurentians at 4:17 in the morning. She put the truck in park and sat there for a moment, with both hands on the wheel, and she was not sure she could open the door. Koda stood in the passenger seat. He had been standing the entire drive, swaying with the turns, watching the road like it was his job. And he looked at her, and she thought, ridiculously, that she should leave him in the truck, that they probably didn't allow dogs in emergency rooms, that she was being irrational. She opened the door, and Koda came with her because he was not going to stay in the truck, and they both knew it. He walked at her left side through the sliding glass doors, close enough that his shoulder touched her leg with every step. She was aware that she looked alarming, 4 days in the same clothes, fever grey, one hand pressed to her right side, a large military dog attached to her like a second shadow. The intake nurse looked up, and then looked again. Tova gave her name, her date of birth, her symptoms. She did it in the flat, organized way she'd learned to do things when her brain was only partly engaged. Triage thinking. Just the relevant information, just the facts. Appendix, she thought. Or infection. Either way, she needed antibiotics and she needed someone who was not her. "The dog," the nurse said, not unkindly. "He stays." Tova said it without inflection, without apology. It was not a request. The nurse looked at Koda. Koda looked at the nurse. He had stopped being openly threatening when they'd come through the doors. He was not a dog who wasted energy on display. But there was something in his stillness that communicated plainly, and without drama, that this was not a negotiable point. The nurse pulled her radio slightly closer. "I'll need to speak to the charge. He's a retired military working dog." Tova leaned on the intake desk, not because she was trying to be intimidating, but because she needed to lean on something. "He's attached to me. If you separate us, one of us is going to become a problem for your staff, and it isn't going to be me." The nurse, her name badge read Fournier, Sylvie, which Tova registered and immediately filed away, looked at her for a moment with the particular measured expression of a healthcare professional who has seen most things and is deciding which category this one falls into. "Bed 3, she said finally. "Keep him on the floor." They put a line in her arm and took her blood and pressed on her abdomen in several places while she stared at the ceiling and breathed carefully. Koda lay on the floor at the foot of the gurney with his chin on his paws and his eyes moving between Tova and the door in a slow, patient arc. Twice, a orderly came too close too quickly, and Koda rose to all fours without a sound, just stood there, and both times the orderly found another route without being asked. The attending physician, Dr. Hebert, a slight Quebecois man in his 50s with reading glasses pushed up on his head and the particular calm of someone who had been doing emergency medicine for a very long time, reviewed her chart and her imaging and said, "Measured appendicitis, not yet perforated. They'd need to operate this morning." And then English when she didn't respond fast enough, and she said, "Yes, Fine. What do I do with the dog? Dr. Hebert looked at Koda. He looked at Tova. I'll find someone, he said. What he found was a patient care assistant named Margot Ouelle who had, it turned out, grown up on a farm in the eastern townships and was entirely unimpressed by large dogs. She sat on a chair outside the surgical prep area, and Koda sat 3 feet from her, and they regarded each other in mutual neutral assessment while Tova was wheeled away, and the last thing Tova saw before the double doors swung shut was Koda's amber eyes tracking her, steady and unblinking, all the way to the wall. She woke up in a recovery bay with the particular cotton-mouthed, time-disoriented feeling of coming out of general anesthesia, and the first thing she was aware of was the absence of Koda. The second thing she was aware of was that someone was sitting beside the bed. She turned her head, which took more effort than it should have, and saw a young woman, mid-20s, dark hair pulled back, wearing civilian clothes rather than scrubs, with a hospital visitor badge clipped to her jacket. She was sitting forward in her chair with her elbows on her knees, and she was watching Tova with an expression Tova couldn't immediately read. "Where's my dog?" Tova said. Her voice was rough and did not quite cooperate. "He's with Margot," the young woman said. "He's fine. He hasn't moved from the door." She paused. "I came to ask you about him." Tova looked at her more carefully. The visitor badge said Flet Cora. The name moved through Tova like cold water. "Who are you?" she said, though she already knew the shape of the answer. "I'm Jamie's sister." The young woman held her gaze steadily. She had the same coloring Jamie had, the same set to her jaw. "Cora Flet. I'm a paramedic. I was doing a transport shift here when they brought you in, and one of the nurses mentioned the dog, and She stopped. Something moved through her face quickly, something she controlled. "I needed to see if it was Koda." The room was very quiet. Down the hall, someone's monitor chimed once and then settled. "How did you know he was with me?" Tova said. "The handler liaison sends quarterly updates. You're listed as his care contact." Cora looked down at her hands for a moment. "I tried to get custody of him, after Jamie. They said Koda had already been assigned." Tova closed her eyes. She thought about 8 months in a cabin she'd chosen because no one could reach her. She thought about the satellite phone turned away on the windowsill. She thought about the liaison officer's folder and the photograph of Jamie laughing at something she hadn't seen. "He doesn't eat when I'm not there," she said finally. It was not quite what she'd meant to say, but it was true, and truth seemed like the right currency for this particular conversation. "I know." Cora's voice was even. "He was the same after Jamie. The vet said it was grief, the actual medical term, not a metaphor." Tova opened her eyes. The young woman was watching her with an expression that was not accusatory and not plaintive and not any of the things Tova had spent 8 months on a mountain trying to preemptively avoid. It was just direct, steady, the expression of someone who had also been carrying something for a very long time and had gotten tired of pretending otherwise. "He blamed himself," Tova said. The words came out before she could decide whether to say them. "Jamie, he blamed himself for the kid on the route we'd flagged." She stopped. "You didn't need to know that." "Yes, I did," Cora said quietly. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortably. Outside, the Laurentian winter was going about its business. Somewhere in the hospital, on the other side of a set of double doors, a Belgian Malinois with amber eyes was sitting at attention and waiting, as he had always waited, with a patience that made something in Tova's chest feel simultaneously smaller and larger than usual. "He was a good handler," she said. "It came out rough. The best I served with." Cora nodded. She did not say thank you, which Tova appreciated. Thank you was the wrong shape for this. They were quiet again for a moment. Then Cora said, "Can I ask you something?" Tova looked at the ceiling. "Probably. How long were you planning to stay up there?" "In the cabin." The question hung in the air. Tova thought about it honestly, which she hadn't done in 8 months. "I don't know," she said at last. "Until it felt like enough time had passed, I suppose." She paused. I don't think I'd worked out what enough meant. Cora was quiet for a beat. Then, I have a place in St. Agath. I have a yard. It's fenced. She said it without pressure, without sentimentality, entirely matter of fact, the way a paramedic offers information. Not a plea, not an ultimatum, just a fact placed on the table for Tova to look at or not look at as she chose. Tova looked at the ceiling for a while longer. She thought about Koda, 6 years old, sitting at another door waiting. She thought about the satellite phone on the windowsill and the 11 days of silence and the 40 minutes down the mountain in the dark, and Cora Flett in a hard hospital chair with her elbows on her knees and Jamie's jaw and no particular desire to pretend that any of this was fine. She thought about what Jamie had told her once, on a night patrol outside a town she no longer let herself name, about his sister, who was going to be a paramedic, who was going to save people by profession, who had their mother's stubbornness and their father's wit capacity for sitting quietly in hard places without running away from them. She'll be good at it, he'd said. She's the kind of person who doesn't flinch. Tova turned her head and looked at Cora Flett, who was waiting with the simple, undemanding patience of someone who had learned to wait in difficult rooms. Tell me about the yard, Tova said. Cora almost smiled. Not quite. Enough. It's got a gate that actually latches, she said, and it's big enough that a dog can run in it. She paused. That's mostly it. That's enough, Tova said. Down the hall, someone propped open the door to the waiting area, and Koda's nails clicked on the linoleum, a sound Tova registered before she was fully aware she was listening for it, and then he was in the doorway of the recovery bay, amber eyes finding her immediately across the room, and the low, sustained sound he made was not quite a whine, and not quite a bark, but something in between. Something that had no clean military classification. Margot Ouellette appeared behind him, slightly breathless. He knew somehow. It's fine, Cora said, standing to make room. Koda crossed the floor to the side of the bed in 4 even strides and put his chin on the mattress beside Tova's hand, and stayed there, not moving, not asking for anything. Just present, just the weight of his head, and the warmth of him, and the amber eyes that watched her face with an attention so complete it felt, sometimes like being seen. Tova put her hand on the back of his head the way she always did, without thinking about it. She looked at Cora, who was standing on the other side of the bed with her jacket zipped and her visitor badge slightly crooked. Someone who had driven to a hospital on her day off because she'd heard a dog might be there, because some things pull at you, even when you've decided to be done with being pulled. He trusted Jamie completely, Tova said. She didn't entirely know why she was saying it. Koda. From the first day. Some dogs take weeks to bond with a new handler, Koda just decided, and that was it. Cora looked at the dog for a long moment. He used to do that with people too, she said. Jamie, he'd just decide about someone. Right away, no reason you could point to. She glanced up at Tova. He decided about you. He talked about you. She paused. Good things, just so you know. Tova's chest did something she did not have a name for. Outside the window, the Laurentians were white and enormous and indifferent. The way places are when they are very old, and have seen many small human griefs come and go without altering in the slightest. The birch trees stood at the edge of what she could see, thin and stripped, and very still. The IV line in her arm dripped at its small, regular interval. Koda breathed. Tova Rennick, who had driven 40 minutes down a mountain in the dark rather than use a phone, who had turned her back on every outstretched hand for 8 months, who had understood the geometry of grief as something you survived by making yourself very small and very far from other people, lay in a hospital bed in Saint-Donat and thought about a fenced yard in Saint-Agath, and a latch that actually worked. I need about 2 weeks to recover, she said. After discharge, Cora said. I'm not easy to be around. I work in emergency medicine, Cora said. Define easy. Something shifted in Tova's face. It was not quite a smile either, but it was in the family of smiles, a distant relative, the kind that shows up when you've stopped expecting it. She looked down at Koda. who had not moved, who would not move until she did. Wyatt implicitly trusted you with his entire life. Someone had said to someone once, in a different story, in a different winter. The words fit here too. Across the distance, across the particular stubborn solidarity of people who have served beside those they could not save, Jamie had decided about her. Right away, no reason you could point to. She thought that might be the most generous thing anyone had ever done for her, and she had never once let herself think about it until now. "Okay," she said at last, to Cora, to Koda, to the white morning coming through the window. "Tell me how to find the yard."